if you record the drum set and you've got a bunch of closed mics and a set of overheads and you pull the overheads out, it's like you've got drums in space, right? The like shells are just kind of floating there. Usually, you don't really want that, right? You want this glue, which the overheads really bring.
This is the Self-Recording Band Podcast, the show where we help you make exciting records on your own, wherever you are, DIY style. Let's go. Hello and welcome to the Self-Recording Band Podcast. I am your host, Benedict Hyde, and I'm here with my friend and co-host, Malcolm Owen Flood. Hi, Malcolm. How are you?
Hey, Benny. I'm good, man. I'm really good. I had a awesome weekend of recording drums, actually, and other things, guitars, lots of stuff. But the drums in particular were super awesome. It was possibly my favorite drum sound that I've captured live off the floor.
Oh, that sounds great. Which studio did you use?
I was at Silverside Sound, which is just down the road from me. I do a lot of stuff there. It's like a big, live, very live, ambient sounding room, and it was perfect for the song we were doing. Very explosive sounding, bombastic.
Yeah, that's a preference of both of us, as we've already said a couple of times. Anything specifically new that you tried, or anything exciting that's worth mentioning?
Yeah, so a couple quick things. So for some of the podcast listeners, you may be aware that I do location sound mixing for film projects. So I'm on set with a mixer, recording actors, and swinging a boom pole around a lot. And I decided to bring my shotgun mic, which is a Sennheiser MKH 416, great shotgun mic, and throw that up as a mono overhead, which was really, really cool. Which we're going to be talking about in this episode. So maybe I'll come back to that. I'll circle back to that. But the other thing I did, which we've done before, is there's this big hallway that kind of leads out of the live room and along the side of the control room. So you have to kind of go through a few doors to get to the control room. It's pretty removed, but there's this long hallway. And we usually throw a mic out there at the end of the hallway. And it's so delayed. It's really, the door is closed even in front of it. And it's super trashy and delayed. It's my favorite room mic. But I decided to throw a ribbon up there, and it sounded awesome, super awesome. Darker the better. But I then gated it to only release on the snares. So it's this big, huge snare kind of thing that was happening in real time as we tracked. It was awesome.
Wow. So I was about to ask, so you did that, you committed the gate.
Yes, but I had a mult going. So a mult, for listeners that don't know, is just an alternate recording of that capture. So one was going to just nothing. So I had that there, but I just kind of turned it off. And then I had the gated version that was just accenting our snares live.
Cool.
Yeah.
So did you do that with a hardware gate or a plugin?
No, I actually used Pro G. I had no idea that you could record zero latency with that FabFilter plugin. And it's awesome. Yeah. And even if it was delayed, it was the snare is so behind the real snare, the close mic, because of the space, the amount of distance, that it didn't really matter, right?
Yeah, I was about to say, in real time, you don't have look ahead or anything like that, but you don't really need to because you have a couple of milliseconds in between anyway.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So it worked awesome. It was really, really cool. It was very mixed sounding already.
Cool. That's sick. By the way, if we have an episode on committing things on the way in, on recording through compression, EQ, gates, or whatever. So if you haven't listened to that, go check that out, because we talk about exactly that thing in this episode, and talk about when and why not to do this. So it's it's episode 34. So the episode before today's episode. If you haven't checked that out yet, go listen to that. And it's all about that topic. Definitely. Yeah, it's basically everything you just said is right on topic, because today's topic is also about drums. It's about drum overhead specifically. And I want to hear more about the mono overhead thing that you did there. But first, I want to tell you what today's episode is exactly about. And the title is Overheads Are Not Just Cymbal Mics. And that is because many people think of overheads as cymbal mics, but they can be much more than that. And it totally depends on what you're trying to do, on your sonic vision, on the vibe you're trying to get. And we feel it's important because overheads are super important for the overall drum sound. It's just a big part of it. And choosing the wrong approach here can potentially like ruin the whole drum recording. Basically, you can totally go off in the wrong direction if you choose the wrong overhead approach, because that can really dictate how the overall drum kit sounds. And we're gonna show you the difference between like what we call overheads and like cymbal mics, like what's the difference here and why there is a difference. We will talk about what overheads do or can do to your drum sound other than pick up cymbals. And we're going to talk about some examples and specific approaches and specific overhead setups for different scenarios. So yeah, that's what today's episode is about. And I'd like to hear why and you chose to use that mono overhead and what it did for you and like what was the goal here.
Yeah. So it's the perfect discussion because you said the title is overheads are not just cymbal mics. So we should talk about placement before we get into it.
Yeah.
And depending on where you place the overheads, you're going to get more shells versus more cymbals. And how close you get to things also is going to affect that, right? And yeah, a lot of people might think that they're just up there to get the cymbals, so they just place them like directly over top of the cymbals, and you end up with no or very little shells, or worse, bad sounding bleed of shells. And that can be fine. And we'll talk about why sometimes that might be the desired thing as well. But generally, a good starting place is to try and get an actual kind of picture of the kit, right? Where you could listen to just the overheads and it sounds pretty awesome. It sounds like the drummer's really kicking ass. Now, where I was running into problems, not problems, but I've been doing a lot of mixing and I was like, okay, I want more kick and snare up the middle information, but still with that kind of roomy sound that overheads have compared to a close mic. So I went with my spaced pair overheads as usual, which is, for anybody that hasn't done it, they're spaced out over the drum kit, left and right. And that just by default puts them more over the cymbals than something up the middle would. And that sounds great, but again, I wanted more of that middle stuff. So I threw up this shotgun mic in the center. And shotgun mics are a figure 8 pattern that have extremely good rejection on the sides. People kind of think that they can just like hone in and point across football stadiums and hear the person on the other side. And it's not quite like that, but it's fine to think of it that way in that they are very directional and just have awesome rejection. So I pointed it in center, kind of angled it so that the sides were kind of hitting the cymbals as much as possible and just got this really like awesome mostly kick and snare mix going into that, which kind of filled the hole in my space pairs. So the sum of those three parts kind of equaled a really full picture, I guess. So yeah, that's why I went with it, because I wanted more kick and snare without cymbals.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I mean, Are shotgun mics, just to clarify, is it really a figure 8 or is it just something like a super narrow, like hypercardioid or something like that? I think because you could think of it as a figure of 8 but narrower, right? So
yes, but it does have like a back access, like a figure 8.
Totally.
Yeah.
The more directional it gets, the more sensitive it is on the like off axis, like the backside, not off axis, but the off axis is to the sides. Then basically, yeah.
I think technically you're right. It's like a supercardioid, but you have to be aware of that backside with a shotgun mic, because like if you've got like a low ceiling, a reflective low ceiling, it starts sounding weird.
Oh, okay, yeah, super cool. So how does the bleed of the cymbals then sound in that mic? Is that a problem? Because obviously you have less cymbals on the sides, but does the bleed sound pleasing still, or is it like a harsh?
Yeah, so
problem?
that's a great thing to bring up, because that was something that took me a long time to learn, and I want our listeners to really watch for that, is that less bleed isn't good enough if it sounds terrible. So if like your hi-hats are just like the most deadly sounding things in your like your snare mic or whatever, that's really bad. It will come back to haunt you. You want your bleed to be pleasant. I would take a little extra bleed if it sounds good, and in this case it was so smooth, man. I couldn't believe it. It was great.
Awesome.
Which probably because they kind of designed these shotgun mics to be directional, but they also want the off axis to sound similar, like frequency wise. Even though quieter, they just want it to be quieter, but the same frequency, because there's normally just one guy swinging one mic around and they have to capture like 2 actors. So it lets post bring up the quiet channel and hopefully have a similar frequency response.
Okay, cool.
So yeah, man, it was so awesome. I'm going to do it every time.
I'll have to try that. That's a great idea that I've never tried. I did that with ribbons because of the figure of 8, but with a shotgun mic, I've never tried it, but it makes total sense. So awesome tip here. And like you kind of said it already, like the whole thought process behind is whether you want more shells or cymbals, and whether you want like, depending, I think the two extreme scenarios is one, if you're going to rely heavily on the close mics or even samples, you're going to want to pick up more cymbals. And if you want to have a real organic three-dimensional representation of the whole kit, including shells, and you want a more roomy, a little more distant, organic type of sound, then you probably want to get more of the shells in the overheads, because otherwise you get a very upfront direct sound on the shells. So these are the two extreme scenarios, and everything in between, of course. So in your case, it's kind of a mix. You wanted the cymbal clarity and you wanted the stereo width and everything, but with an added like punch and like power from the shells, from the kick and snare especially.
Yeah, and now I've got control over that like blend, right? I can turn down the center channel, you might call it, if I want it to get wider, or vice versa. So I was just really happy with the result and think it covered my bases pretty good.
Cool. So the reason why I wanted to do this episode, the main reason, is the following problem. Oftentimes when people send me stuff to mix, that they recorded themselves, they view overheads as cymbal mics. They put them right above the cymbals to capture all the cymbals, and they don't really care about the kit. And then they often don't have the best or most consistent like playing, or they didn't put enough attention to like on like the tuning and how the individual shells sound. So they have the close mics as well, but they don't particularly sound really great. So the only option I have then is to either replace them, and then I'm fine with the cymbals. But if they want the real kit to come through and they want me to use the close mics, but they don't sound really good, I'm stuck with these not really good sounding close mics. They often have a lot of bleed. They are inconsistent. I have to compress them a lot, which makes the bleed problem even worse. And if there is more of the whole kit in the overheads, that's less of a problem, because I have to use less of the close mics to make it work, because I have plenty of snare and toms and stuff in the overheads, and I just need the close mics to give a little extra push, but I don't need to rely heavily on those less than ideal signals. So when people say they don't really care about the close mics, they just want to use samples, then I'm pretty okay with cymbal mics, if every cymbal is represented well and if that's the goal. But if they want a more organic sound and they want their real kit to come through, then I'm kind of stuck. If the close mics suck and the overheads don't really have shells, then what am I supposed to do? So that's the main reason why I bring this up. And so it's worth thinking about before you even put a microphone on your drum kit, I think, and before you start recording, it's worth thinking about the aesthetic that you want. And if the goal is this organic, three-dimensional, wide and accurate stereo field and everything, then you should have a well-tuned drum kit, B, a room that works, C, a good drummer, of course, and then you should choose an overhead configuration that represents the whole kit as good as possible. And then in addition to that, you put all the close mics in there. So that's basically how you should approach it if that's the goal.
Yeah, I totally agree. Like, recording with the end in mind is an awesome approach. If I know that it's going to be like a very modern, punchy kick that's probably going to be a sample, I'll try and pile moving blankets on top of the kick, to try and pull it out of our overheads, because the more information of the shells that are in the overheads, the kind of harder it is to replace them if they're bad sounding, right? Because there's sample replacement or there's sample augmenting, and that's the difference, right?
Yeah.
is it do we need to replace this and try and make it sound like that bad sounding drum never existed, or are we just trying to reinforce it with a different sample?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think a really good thing to watch out for is the overall balance of all the elements of the kit in the overhead. So if you're just going with cymbals, have the drummer play through every piece. And if something sounds like twice as loud as everything else, even if it's a cymbal, that's going to be a problem, right? It needs to be really balanced. I think that's a really good thing to strive for, is that nothing seems over
I know exactly what you mean. Overhead balance is really everything. And depending on the amount of inputs that you have, there are different things you can do. So if you have limited inputs, you have to find an overhead configuration that just like lets you capture the kit in a balanced way. But if you have enough inputs, the other thing you could do is you could go with the overhead configuration that like you like, and that gives you the amount of room sound and like the sound you want. And then if something is like underrepresented, then you can just use additional cymbal spot mics. So you can use those overheads, but if there is like a ride cymbal or a china or an additional crash or whatever that's just too quiet in the overheads, you can just put a spot mic on that cymbal and feature it that way and bring it out.
Yes.
So that's the other way you can do it. But in most cases, in the DIY scenarios, if you're like limited to 8 inputs, you need to find an overhead pair that just works, and it's gonna be a compromise often. So you probably won't have the clearest, most direct cymbal sound and get all the shells really punchy with just one pair of mics. It's gonna be somewhere in between, I think. But that's totally fine. You just have to experiment and do what Malcolm just said. Like hit every piece of the kit and listen closely if that is the balance that you're going for.
Yeah. And like the balance in volume, but also in placement, right? If you've got your mic set up kind of in a wonky position, it might sound like your floor tom is like 4 leagues away to the right, and then your snare is up to the like way off to the left, and that's not how drum kits sound, right?
No.
So you want to be careful with that stuff as well. Make sure that it sounds like you're standing in front of a drum kit or at a drum kit, depending on how you perceive things. But I think I've always been happiest when my overheads sound like a drum kit. It's like I just solo them and it's like, okay, this sounds like a good drum kit, rather than like, okay, this just sounds like the crash and the ride, which there's a time and a place for that. But again, I would really recommend you start with going for a balanced picture of the kit.
Yeah.
That's like almost always a good call, unless you've just got the worst sounding drums, and then you really want to avoid the shells.
Yeah. Agreed.
Yeah.
The only exception I can think of where it is clear from the beginning that you don't want to do that is maybe if you want to do a really modern, heavy, upfront like metal drum sound where it's clear that you're going to use samples more than anything, and it should have this aesthetic. So if that's the goal, then maybe try to keep the shells out of the overheads as much as possible and just really use cymbal mics, maybe even aim them away from the shells a bit. So sometimes what I sometimes do is I have a spaced pair over the crash cymbals and then spot mics on each individual cymbal, and then I just angle them in a way that they reject a little bit of the snare and kick and everything. You only do that if you really are sure that the majority of the close mic, the shell sound, will come from samples. Yes. In all other cases, like basic rock music, or especially if it's something organic, like imagine a blues recording or something like that, and you want a vintage kit like in full glory, like the whole kit, like how it sounds in the room. You don't want cymbal mics. You want overheads that capture the whole thing, and you probably don't even need as much of the close mics in there. Yeah. if done right.
Yeah, like that kind of style is overheads with sneaking in the close mics to reinforce that picture, right? Like you've got a full picture with your overheads or your rooms, and then you're using the close mics to kind of beef it up a little.
Yeah,
and so it is a different approach. If you can, and we realize that not everybody can, but if you can, do both,
Yes.
like cover your cymbals and get like a kit picture from the overhead. There's a lot of energy that comes off the shells, off the whole performance. If you have like a full performance capture from up above, that's what makes people boogie, I think.
Totally agree. And before you do all that, one piece of advice that we need to put in this episode is the phase is very, very crucial, very important with all of this. We don't need to go into all the details in this episode because we have a whole episode on that topic. So if you haven't yet, go listen to episode 4 of the podcast, which is all about drum phase. Because you need to understand this, especially the more mics you're going to add to the whole thing. The more complicated it gets, the more you're going to run into phase problems. And unless you understand that concept and get that right, it doesn't really make sense to add more microphones. So go listen to episode 4. It's called How to Improve Your Recordings Big Time and Get Punchy Drums by Avoiding Phase Issues. And that's just a crucial episode that everyone needs to listen to, whoever wants to record drums. Period.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and that episode's helpful for other instruments too. So definitely worth a listen.
Yes.
Do you ever do mono drums?
Like a mono overhead or mono drums, the whole drum kit mono?
Let's say both.
Yeah, okay. So mono overheads, definitely yes. I haven't tried the shotgun thing, but I tried other mono overheads in addition to the spaced pair. So that, yes. Sometimes it's my center of the kit mic, trash mic thing that I use. It's not an overhead, but it does a similar thing in the center of the drum kit. So that's one thing I like to do. And mono drums, I don't think I've ever made a record with completely mono drums, but I've definitely made some with like pretty narrow drums. So there was a little bit of a stereo image, but pretty narrow.
Right.
But I like to listen, and that's something I recently discovered again, or rediscovered again. I was into that a couple years ago, and now I rediscovered it. There are some records, even some pretty heavy modern records like that seem to be super wide, just because the drums are basically mono, or they are mono, and then the guitars seem super wide because there is this gap between the drums and the guitars. And it's kind of like watching a band on a big stage with the drum kit in the middle and the speakers left and right of the stage or something like that. And that's something I kind of like, because I think in many modern productions, when there is this wide drum image, it's kind of weird that the cymbals or the hi-hats are like outside of the guitars sometimes, or at least somewhere where the guitars are. So the drum kit is basically everywhere, and then you have the guitar player left and right. And with a more narrow or even mono drum kit, you have like this more realistic image of a band, because the drum kit is more or less mono if you watch it on a stage, So I'm kind of into that. One record comes to mind. I even mentioned it on the podcast once. I think it's by a band called Code Orange. They used to be called Code Orange Kids. Now they are called Code Orange. And I think Kurt Ballou did the record. I'm not entirely sure, but I think. And they have mono drums, very heavy mono drums, and super wide guitars, and it sounds insane. So
cool.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. I just wanted to mention it because it is an approach you can consider. Just throwing one mic up there and going for all the drums come up the middle. It's always the cymbals that I'm like, I wish I wish it wasn't so mono. But I've done it a few times, and it has been cool. And it's, when you picture it with the guitars, it can really be interesting. One time I did it, and it was all mono, but I still panned my tom mics. So we kind of had like those moments where like, kind of thing, but then otherwise it was come up the middle.
Yeah. Another thing that I would like to mention is when we're talking about what overheads can actually do to your drum sound other than pick up cymbals. So one thing is the width and the depth and the realism and the room we were talking about. But another thing is I feel like transients come through in a cool way in overheads. So the stick attack, overheads usually don't get crushed as hard as close mics. You maybe have a little limiting going on, or maybe a little bit of compression. But if you leave them kind of natural in the mix, then you have a very pretty natural dynamics in there, and a pretty cool transients. If they're good mics, if they're good condenser mics or ribbons or whatever, you have this very precise, almost like audiophile, transients that that's just something I really like if done well. That's just cool because it adds dynamics to the sampled or overly compressed close mics, and it just makes it more lively to me. And I kind of like how that sounds, especially because usually you tend to add a bit of top end to the overheads to make the cymbals shine more, so that brings out the stick attack and the highs, the treble in the shells even more. Mm-hmm. And I kind of like that. Yep. I also like the way the snares, so that the sizzly stuff of the actual snares sound on overheads. So if I have that in the overheads, I don't need as much of the snare bottom mic. And I often prefer how a snare sounds with a little distance compared to the close snare bottom mic. So that's also a thing that I'm pretty into. And sometimes even the way a kick beater sounds in the overheads can be cool and add realism to a modern kick drum that's usually pretty heavily processed and doesn't sound as realistic anymore. And there's something to how drums sound from a distance, basically, that I just like, and that overheads can give you if you have a couple like a lot of shells in there.
It's more accurate to how drums actually sound, right? Like drums don't sound like your head's up against the snare, or like you're inside the kick drum. Like that's not how drums sound. So the overheads are a much more accurate picture of what we hear when we're in a room with a drum kit. And if you record the drum set and you've got a bunch of close mics and a set of overheads and you pull the overheads out, it's like you've got drums in space, right? The like shells are just kind of floating there, and then you start bringing it back in until it kind of like the picture becomes complete. And some music seems to be fine with the drums in space thing, but usually you don't really want that, right? You don't want it like to seem like your kick and snare are being played by different people.
Yeah.
You want this glue, which the overheads really bring.
Yeah, totally. Oh, and another thing is, if you're unsure about drum tuning, if you're still learning here and you have maybe a weird ring in there, or like you have weird cardboard like tom, like resonance or whatever, I feel that this stuff is way worse in the close mics than it often is in the overheads. So sometimes when I have a really ringy or annoying snare that I actually don't want in the mix, or when I have a weird frequency that just bothers me in the tom close mics, oftentimes in the overheads it's not as bad. And if there's a lot of shells in the overheads, then I can bring back some of the natural drum sound without like having to use the crappy close mics again. So I don't know why that is, but I think I can get away with less than ideal tuning more in the overheads than I can in the close mics. So
yeah. Every once in a while, I get to mix something that's like kind of meant to sound crappy.
Yeah.
Like it's just like this grungy drum kit, broken mic pair, and like everything sucks. They recorded it too hot, but it's like suits the song. It's distorted and ugly. And in those cases, it's almost all the overheads in the room mics. It's just like this natural kind of thing. It doesn't need that close mic stuff. And it's so in those cases, the tuning's always terrible, and it just works in that case. But if it was the close mics, like I'd never be able to make it sound vibey like they want.
Yeah. Okay, question for you.
Yes.
Because we should mention that because I think a big part of our audience doesn't record real drums, but they program them. And
Right.
if you program drums, or if you would like have client program drums for something you are about to mix, would you like have bleed, like shell bleed in the overheads, or would you program cymbals only? So would you like mimic the shell sound in the overheads in case of programmed drums? Because that's what people always ask. So
I would. I totally would. I think. I don't think I'd know what to do without without that bleed.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
Because it's not bleed in an overhead. It's not bleed. It's meant to be there.
It's meant to be there. Yeah. But it's called
exactly.
weirdly. Yeah, you're totally right. Weirdly enough, on some plugins or like virtual drum kits, they call it bleed, and you can adjust how much snare is in the overheads, something like that. And I feel like people are afraid to use that dial and like dial in snare and toms, and they just send only cymbals because they think the more separation, the better. But again, then we are left with this drums in space thing.
Yeah.
Even more
totally.
so with programmed drums, maybe.
Bleed can't exist in an overhead unless it's like from another instrument, like a guitar cab,
Yeah.
But bleed can exist in close mics, and arguably should as well. But that's where you want to minimize bleed, is the close mics, because that's the point. You're trying to get like as much of a isolated signal to noise ratio on a specific drum with close mics. But with overheads and rooms, that's not the goal. That said, I realize now that at the beginning of this episode, I said I threw up a shotgun mic with the like sole purpose of trying to reject cymbals.
Yeah, right.
It's funny.
Yeah.
Yep.
But you had a space pair in addition to that, so
yes,
it served a specific purpose. There's one thing that I would leave out of the overheads, or I wouldn't leave it out of the overheads, but I would turn it down maybe more than dial it in, is the hi-hats. Because the hi-hats, if there is a close mic for the hi-hats, and if there is a little bit of that in the overheads and the rooms, they are almost never too quiet, or almost never, too quiet. So that's maybe the only thing that really bothers me with overheads, is if the crashes are where they are and the balance is right and everything, but then there are super loud hi-hats in there, and they are not really to the side either, so they're somewhere like in the center of or in between somewhere, floating around and super loud, and I can't get rid of them. That's pretty annoying. So other than the balance, it's a balancing thing, but other than the balance between the crash cymbals and the kit itself, the shells, I would pay extra attention to how loud the hi-hat is, where it is in the stereo field, and I would try to have it as quiet as possible because it's always going to be there. And with programmed drums as well, I would be careful to have too much hi-hat in the overheads. So that's maybe the only thing. Yeah.
Yeah, just in the session on the weekend, that was definitely something we worked on. We went through the kit, and the hi-hats just seemed like twice as loud as everything else. So we had to sort that out. Otherwise, I would have been totally screwed come mix town.
Yeah. Which brings us to another thing, which is stuff for an entire new episode. But cymbal choice obviously makes a big difference. So if you have like really loud, annoying, thick cymbals, especially hi-hats, that's going to be a real problem. So you want to start by choosing the right cymbals, obviously. But there's a lot to talk about there, maybe on another episode. We already said we want to do an episode on instruments, so maybe we should do that and talk about not about microphones, not about recording techniques, but about the instruments themselves.
Definitely. I mean, one thing I think I would say, though, is we keep saying that the overheads are a picture of the drum kit.
Yeah.
Right? Ideally. And you have to understand that how you set up that picture is what it takes a picture of. So the placement, where you position the cymbals, how high or low, makes a huge difference. So in the case of this, I wanted the hi-hats to be lower or further to the left. The drummer has to be flexible to do that. I think in this case, we ended up repositioning the mics actually to balance it out better, which again, that works too. If you can keep the drums in the same spot and move the mics to compensate, but something's got to move in those situations. Otherwise, you're taking a picture from a bad angle. You know, you got like the double chin selfie thing going on.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Totally. I want to bring up like specific, not like things that are not so common but good to know, and some tips and tricks other than what we've been talking about. So one thing that you can do that I like to do, it's a little I just did it on a session last week, actually, in a recording session. One thing you can use overheads for also is you can use them as glue for the whole band. And what I mean by that is if you track the whole band in the same room and you're doing overdubs, so you're not doing a live performance, you do drums first and then whatever comes next. If you can, it can be worth leaving the overheads where they are after you've recorded drums and recording them with the guitars, the bass, the vocals even, everything else you record. Just leave the overheads where they are, leave the settings as they are, and just record them with everything else. And then see if you can blend some of that in, because that kind of gives overdub sessions the feeling that the band has played in the same room. And it kind of, I don't know, it works really well. So the overheads, what has been overheads for the drums, become room mics for guitars and vocals, basically.
Right.
And that's a cool trick that I just used last week, and I really like how that sounds. I don't know why. I mean, I know why, but I don't see people do that often, but it kind of works for me. I don't know.
Yeah, I've done that with my room pair a few times. It's just like, no, let's just leave it there, keep it tracking, and it's like, oh, still sounds good. We'll keep using it.
Yeah. And then another thing, I don't know if you've done it personally, is the separation thing where you track cymbals and shells separately,
right,
and leave the overheads. You have, I haven't done it. It's I get the concept. I think I don't know. I just haven't tried it yet. I couldn't convince a drummer to do it, or but
it was a weird experience. It was a certain song. You know, we had I think 4 songs with that band, and this one just needed to be different. And we were also kind of writing the drum part on the fly and changing it a lot of stuff. And it was like, okay, this is the way to do it. We're going to just like work on shells only, and then we're going to come back and add cymbals in. And so we can just focus on patterns kind of thing. And we knew we wanted it to sound more drum machine-y than the rest of the songs. And it ended up working, but it was not quicker. It was not a time-saving thing, which I think people might think it is. I think unless the drummer has practiced playing without cymbals extensively, it's not going to help you save time at all.
Yeah.
And it's way more work on the computer side of things.
Yeah.
Tons.
Yeah, I agree. But if you do that was why I was asking, or why I was bringing it up. You record one pass, all the shells, one pass, all the cymbals. Let's say you do it like that. Do you leave the overheads up there and you record it with the shells? Or when you do shells only?
Totally.
Okay.
Yeah. That's actually the biggest advantage, I think, is that you have these room mics and overhead mics of the shells that don't have cymbals in them. So you can really go nuts on them and get like that room activated in a big way with compression and stuff. That's definitely the biggest advantage. The close mics were almost irrelevant after a certain point.
That's what I was asking. But I think that some people, because I've seen people try it, because they've heard that some record has been done that way, and what they often do is they record cymbals with overheads, and then they move the overheads away, and then they set up the kit without cymbals, and they just record close mics, and they think that's how you do it. But I think they kind of miss the point, actually, if they do that.
They did.
Yeah.
Yeah, because like you said, the title of this episode is "Overheads Are Not Cymbal Mics."
Yes,
Not just cymbal mics.
Yes.
Yeah. That would be the misconception. There is that they think those mics are there just for that job, and that is not the case.
Cool. Before we wrap it up, let's bring up some examples and possible scenarios. So one could be if you're doing an XY pair, for example. We've been talking about that in another episode. If you do an XY in the kind of in the center above the snare somewhere spot of the drum kit, you're gonna end up with like a lot of the shells probably, and a little narrower image, a realistic image, but a narrow image of the kit. And that could be a case where you might want to use additional cymbal spot mics if you're not able to capture everything in this XY pair. But you got to make sure you position them in a way and angle them, or like turn them around until you have the cymbal balance as well with an XY. That's what I wanted to say basically.
Having done a lot of XY in my day, experiment with the height as well.
Yeah.
To affect that balance. To kind of the higher you go, the more you're going to introduce into the stereo field.
Yeah, of course. And the less body of the shells you'll get, and more cymbal stuff. Yeah, totally. So that's one setup. Then, what you just described, the space pair, what you described in the beginning, the space pair, maybe with an additional mono thing. Mm-hmm. Could be an option.
Yep.
ORTF is somewhere in between.
Yep. Yeah, that's cool. There's just the mono, which is not for the faint of heart. But worth experimenting with for sure. I think you'll know when you want that.
Yeah. And then there's the really cymbals only, shells only approach. And I think the more you go in that direction, if you choose to replace the drums and you want to have like really as much separation as possible, the more you do that, the less important it gets to have the center correct. Like if with all the other techniques, the XY, the RTF, the space pair overheads, you want to have that line through the kick and snare. You want to have the kick and snare in the center, basically, and you want to position the mics around that. But the more you go into the extreme close mic setup, like it's just not as important anymore, and all you want to have is like maximum separation. Yeah. So that's basically it. I mean, anything else that comes to mind, or any?
I mean, there's like the Glenn Johns thing and stuff, but I'm sure there's a ton that people have probably started naming their own approaches and stuff, and we don't know them all. So, but like those are the big ones, and I think our listeners hopefully get the point we're making is that they're just not only cymbal mics. Almost always you want to get some shells.
Yes, and place them with the end result in mind. That's just that's the main takeaway. If you only like remember one thing from that episode, it's got to be that. Imagine how the thing should sound in the end. Think about productions you really like. Listen to them, how they sound. Do you hear a larger than life, unrealistic, super close up, wide drum kit, or do you hear something that sounds like a drum kit in a room? And that should dictate your approach.
Yeah, that's great.
All right, cool. So one call to action for you guys here. If you want us to give feedback on your drum recordings, if you are unsure what the right approach is for the music you're trying to make, or if you're still playing around with this and you're not sure what the right thing is to do, you can send us your drum recordings. You can do that via email, like personally, and we will listen to it. We will give you feedback. And the way to do it is you need to be subscribed to the email list. If you're already on that list, just reply to one of the emails I'm sending out and send me a link, a Dropbox link or WeTransfer or whatever you have, and I'll listen to your drum recordings. Maybe add some info on like what are you trying to do, maybe some references, something that so that I know if this is going in the right direction. Maybe some info on your setup, the amount of inputs you have. The more info, the better. And I will have a listen, and Malcolm as well will have a listen, and we will send you feedback. And if you're already on that list, as I said, just reply to an email. And if you're not on that list, the way to get there is go to theselfrecordingband.com, download any of our free stuff there, the 10-step guide to successful DIY recording, the essential gear guide, or the mic placement cheat sheet. Any of that will get you subscribed to the list, and then you can just submit your stuff. And I always like to do that. I always like to interact with people, and I love to get emails like that and to be in touch personally, basically. So yeah, absolutely. I just encourage you to take advantage of that and get some free advice and coaching there, basically.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Yeah, that's it for this episode. Curious to hear your results. Curious to hear your drum sounds. And yeah, see you next week. Thank you for listening.
See you next week. Bye.
Bye.